Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're unpacking one of the most dynamic, fascinating parts of India's democratic structure, the judiciary. We're diving right into Chapter 6 to really understand how this institution acts as the ultimate guardian of the Constitution. And as we'll see, it's definitely not just some quiet place where private disputes are settled, it is a massive political organ that literally shapes the fabric of the nation.
Now, I want you to think about this for a second. What happens when the government itself tries to rewrite the rules of the game? It's a pretty provocative question, right? Well, the Indian judiciary operates as way more than just a passive referee. Ever since 1950, it has been aggressively interpreting and protecting the Constitution. And sometimes that means pushing back hard against the immense power of the legislature itself.
All right, so here's our roadmap for the journey today. We'll start with the rule of law, then look at the power of judicial activism. From there, we'll get into the big one, Parliament versus the judiciary, followed by the basic structure doctrine. And finally, we'll wrap up with power, prestige, and expectations. Okay, let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Rule of Law. Okay, so to really grasp the judiciary's power, we first have to understand why we desperately need it. The rule of law is what levels the playing field. It essentially means that absolutely everyone, whether you're rich or poor, man or woman, no matter your background, is subjected to the exact same law. But here's the catch. For this to actually work, disputes have to be settled by a truly independent body. So the primary job of the judiciary is to protect this rule and ensure the law reigns supreme, completely shielded from the political pressures of the executive or the lawmakers. And to do this, the Supreme Court has a pretty massive, comprehensive toolkit. They have what's called original jurisdiction, meaning they step in directly to resolve huge disputes, like the river Kaveri issue between states. Then there's appellate jurisdiction, allowing them to hear appeals from the lower courts. They even have advisory jurisdiction. That's where the government can actually just ask the court for legal advice on complex topics, like citizenship status. And finally, the big one, judicial review, which is the ultimate power to interpret the Constitution and the laws of the land.
But hey, we need to ground this in reality for a second. While that independence is absolutely crucial, so judges can make rulings without fear of being fired or attacked, the system on the ground still faces some massive practical hurdles. You know the famous saying, justice delayed is justice denied? Well, the sheer volume of paperwork and the incredibly dense legal complexities can sometimes totally frustrate the very justice the system is supposed to provide. It can really slow things down for the everyday citizen.
Section 2. Power of Judicial Activism.
So this brings us to a fascinating evolution, how the court actively steps out of its traditional role to help citizens. The chief instrument driving this shift, the PIL, or Public Interest Litigation. This was a total game changer. Before PILs usually had to be the directly injured party to even step foot in a court. But PILs allowed the court to take up cases on behalf of the wider public. Often, these are started by social workers or just ordinary citizens acting for people who can't afford to represent themselves. It totally transformed the judiciary from a passive referee waiting on the sidelines into this active protector of public rights. In this judicial intervention, it doesn't just stay locked away in a courtroom. It actively impacts daily administrative and policy issues. By stepping in to break deadlocks, like, say, an ongoing nationwide postal strike, the court uses its authority to force action for everyday citizens. It acts as this massive, crucial check on the system whenever things grind to a halt. You might be wondering, though, does all this activism actually get tangible results? Well, yeah, it really does. Take the specific, real-world example from the text. The Supreme Court ordered a massive corporation, Reliance Energy, to pay a staggering 300 crore rupees to Dahanu farmers who grow chiku fruit. Why? Because the company failed to set up a required pollution control plant. That is judicial activism in action, right there, protecting environmental and citizen rights against massive corporate entities.
Moving on to Section 3, Parliament versus the Judiciary.
Now, all this immense power we've been talking about, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It actually led to the ultimate heavyweight constitutional clash. Let's track how this builds step by step. Right after the Constitution was implemented, Parliament wanted to pass land reforms, which meant they had to restrict the right to private property. That's step 1. Step 2. The court steps in and says, nope, you cannot restrict fundamental rights. Step 3. Parliament pushes back, trying to actually amend the Constitution itself to bypass the ruling. And step 4, the court rules that actually, no, even through an amendment, a fundamental right cannot be abridged. It was a massive institutional ping-pong match over who truly has the final say.
And listen, this wasn't just some petty political squabble. It brought up 4 existential constitutional questions. Like, what is the actual scope of the right to property? How much power does Parliament really have to curtail fundamental rights? What are the hard limits on Parliament's power to amend the Constitution? And can they suppress fundamental rights just to enforce state directive principles? These questions literally threaten to cause an outright constitutional crisis.
Section 4. The Basic Structure Doctrine.
So, how did they break the deadlock? It was finally resolved by arguably one of the most important legal concepts in Indian history, the Kesavananda Bharati case. Our sources present this as the absolute ultimate example of how the judiciary uses its power to interpret the Constitution. It forever changed the nature of these conflicts between the lawmakers and the judges.
So what did the court actually decide here? Well, it essentially built 3 pillars. First, it declared that the Constitution has a basic structure, a core identity, that absolutely nobody can violate, not even Parliament through an amendment. Second, it compromised. It said the disputed right to property is actually not part of this basic structure, which finally allowed Parliament to pass its land reforms. But the third pillar? That's the kicker. The court reserved for itself the exclusive right to decide what matters actually belong to this basic structure.
Of course, that leaves us with a bit of a mystery. Why wouldn't the court just tell us once and for all what those basic aspects are? Well, the truth is, the basic structure isn't some static checklist. It's an evolving interpretation. The court decides it on a case-by-case basis. And that deliberate ambiguity, it gives the judiciary incredible ongoing power to check the legislature whenever it feels the core of the Constitution is under threat.
Which leads us into our final section, 5, Power, Prestige, and Expectations.
To really appreciate how the Indian system works, it helps to look at a global comparison from the text. In India, there's a really firm body of common law and judicial precedent. Lower courts respect the rulings of higher courts, and written decisions clearly explain the legal logic. Now, compare that to Ecuador. Over there, journalists' rights can be incredibly unclear because judges aren't actually forced to respect higher court rulings. And appellate judges? They don't even have to provide a written decision explaining their logic. A judge there could literally rule one way today and the exact opposite tomorrow. It really makes you realize how vital the structure of precedent is for creating stability in India.
But look, with all that prestige comes some incredibly high expectations, and of course, public scrutiny. Despite its massive power, the judiciary isn't immune to public cynicism. When politicians celebrate so-called honorable acquittals while vowing they'll never indulge in corruption again, ordinary citizens are often left scratching their heads. They wonder how the wealthy and mighty always seem to secure these easy wins, or how key witnesses suddenly mysteriously change their testimonies. These are very real, everyday concerns about how power, wealth, and influence interact with the justice system.
So here's our final thought for today. The Indian judiciary has fought for and secured immense power, incredible independence, and the authority to be the ultimate guardian of the Constitution's basic structure. But as public expectations keep rising, the ultimate test remains. How will it ensure truly equitable justice for all citizens, rich and poor alike? It's a massive question, and it sits right at the very heart of the democratic experiment. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you all next time.